somewhere between the frozen ports of northern Russia and the burning sands of the Arabian Peninsula, something is being built that most of the world has not yet fully understood. It is not a weapon. It is not a war. It is a road. And that road, if completed on the timeline both governments are pushing for, could quietly shift the balance of global power in a way that no missile ever could. Because the most dangerous thing in the world is not always the thing that makes the loudest noise. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is the thing being built slowly, deliberately, and quietly, 1,000 miles away from the cameras, while everyone with a platform is busy watching something else. This is not a story about armies facing each other across a border. This is not a story about bombs or sanctions or speeches in the United Nations. This is a story about geography, about mountains and seas and deserts and corridors and choke points and the ancient reality that has shaped every empire in human history. The reality that whoever controls the roads controls the world. And once you truly understand the geography at the heart of what Russia and Saudi Arabia are building together right now, you will never look at a world map the same way again. Because what is unfolding between Moscow and Riyadh is not just a diplomatic realignment between two powerful states figuring out their mutual interests. It is the beginning of a fundamental reorganization of how the modern world moves everything it needs to function. And that reorganization is already underway. Think about where Russia sits on this planet. It is the largest country on Earth by land area. It covers more territory than the entire continent of South America. It stretches across 11 time zones, from the edges of Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It has coastline on 3 different oceans and touches the Arctic in the north. It shares borders with 14 countries. From the outside, from the perspective of a world map, it looks like an absolute geographic colossus. A country with more land than any other entity in history. So how is it possible that a country this vast, sitting on this much territory, controlling this many natural resources, is geographically vulnerable? How can the biggest country on Earth be trapped? The answer is ports. And specifically, access to usable unblocked year-round ports that connect Russia to global trade without requiring the permission of countries it either competes with or outright confronts. Every single ocean route that Russia depends on to move its exports, its oil, its gas, its grain, its metals, its timber, its coal, its fertilizers, the commodities that make up the bulk of its economy, every single one of those routes passes through a choke point that somebody else controls. The Baltic Sea exit leads past the coasts of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. All NATO members, every one of them. To get from the Baltic to the open Atlantic, a Russian ship must pass through the narrow Danish Straits, which Denmark, a NATO member, controls. The Black Sea route leads to the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul. Turkey controls the Bosphorus. Turkey is a NATO member. Even if Turkey keeps the strait open, which it has done, that access is a favor, not a right. It can be modified. The Pacific ports of Vladivostok and Nakhodka in Russia's Far East are geographically closer to Tokyo and Seoul than to Moscow. They serve Asian markets, but they add weeks to reaching Europe or Africa or the Americas. And the Arctic ports, Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, Sabeta, require nuclear-powered icebreaker fleets just to keep minimally operational through the frozen months, and the Northern Sea route along the Russian Arctic coast is only navigable for part of the year, even in the best conditions. Russia is, in the most literal geographic sense, a captive of its own coastlines. It is a country imprisoned not by walls or armies, but by the map it was born onto. Every time Russia needs to export something to the world, it depends on infrastructure that runs past countries it cannot control, through waters where rival powers operate freely. Now think about where Saudi Arabia sits. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia anchors the entire Arabian Peninsula. To its west is the Red Sea. To its east is the Persian Gulf. At the tip of that gulf sits the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of all oil traded globally passes every single day. 20%. On normal days, between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil move through that narrow stretch of water between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran. If that strait were ever closed for even a short period, oil markets would go into shock within hours. At the southern entrance to the Red Sea sits the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow channel between the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Ships coming from Asia and heading to the Suez Canal and then into the Mediterranean and European markets have to pass through that strait. There's no other way. Saudi Arabia does not just sit on oil reserves. Saudi Arabia sits at the precise geographic crossroads between Asia, Africa, and Europe. It is positioned at 2 of the world's most critical maritime choke points simultaneously. The geography of Saudi Arabia is, on paper, one of the most powerful geographic positions on the entire planet. Nature placed this country at the center of global trade. But here is the reality that cuts through all of that geographic power. Here's the thing that most people miss entirely when they think about Russia and Saudi Arabia. Both of these countries, despite their enormous geographic advantages, despite the oil and the landmass and the choke points and the strategic positions, have built their entire economic existence around a system that they did not design and do not control. A system built in the West after World War II, a system priced in the West, a system cleared, settled, monitored, audited, and governed by Western institutions operating under Western law and serving Western geopolitical interests. They sell their oil in dollars. They move their international payments through SWIFT, the Belgian-based financial messaging network that the United States can effectively control through its dominance of dollar clearing. They ship their exports through sea lanes that pass beside Western-aligned naval bases, through Western-controlled choke points, and into Western-dominated markets. They hold their sovereign wealth in Western financial institutions. They buy their technology from Western companies. For decades, this arrangement worked well enough. The West was the biggest market. The dollar was the most stable and most liquid currency on Earth. Western banks were the most efficient institutions for managing sovereign wealth. So both countries played the game, and for a long time, both of them benefited from playing it. Then the game changed in a way that shook both governments to their core. The change was February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and European allies responded with the most comprehensive sanctions package ever deployed against a major economy in the history of international finance. Within days, over $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions were frozen completely. Russia's largest banks were cut off from SWIFT. The assets of Russian state-linked companies and individuals were seized across Europe. The ruble lost nearly half its value in weeks. Russian aircraft were grounded because Western leasing companies and maintenance providers refused to honor their contracts. Semiconductors and advanced technology essential to Russian manufacturing were blocked from export. Russian ships were turned away from Western ports. Russian oil became unsellable in most Western markets. The economic infrastructure of the modern world, built and administered in the West, was turned into a weapon all at once, at maximum force, faster than anyone had seen it deployed before. Saudi Arabia watched every detail of this from the sidelines, and the feeling that settled over Riyadh's most senior officials was not sympathy for Russia. It was recognition. Recognition of a risk they had been aware of abstractly, but had never seen demonstrated so clearly and so completely. The recognition that if your entire economy runs on someone else's infrastructure, and if that someone else ever decides you have crossed a line they drew, they can press a button and turn off your country. Saudi Arabia has its own complicated and increasingly strained relationship with Washington. It has been publicly criticized by American presidents and senators over human rights, over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, over its conduct in Yemen, over oil production decisions that Washington did not like. The relationship between Riyadh and Washington, once considered virtually unbreakable because of oil money and American security guarantees and close military ties that dated back to the 1940s, had been developing fractures for years. And what happened to Russia in 2022 made those fractures feel suddenly far more consequential because Saudi Arabia saw a demonstration of exactly what total economic vulnerability looks like when the moment of truth arrives. And so both countries arrived at the same conclusion from very different starting points. Russia arrived there by direct necessity, because the option of continued dependence on Western infrastructure was violently closed to it. Saudi Arabia arrived there by strategic foresight, because it watched a neighboring great power get economically destroyed in real time, and drew the rational conclusion. The conclusion was this: the most secure country in the 21st century is not the country with the most nuclear warheads or the largest GDP. The most secure country is the country that has genuine alternatives. That is never so dependent on any single system that losing access to that system means losing everything. You have to have other roads. You have to build exits before you need them. And you need to start now. The exit they are building together is called the International North-South Transport Corridor, and it is already more real and more advanced than almost anyone in the Western press has acknowledged. Picture a single line drawn across a map of Eurasia. The line begins at St. Petersburg in northwestern Russia, the city that Peter the Great built specifically to give Russia a window onto Europe and the world. From St. Petersburg, the line runs south through the Russian heartland. It passes through the lowlands east of the Caspian Sea and into the Caucasus region, the ancient mountain corridor between Europe and Asia. From there it enters Azerbaijan, the small but strategically vital country sitting between Russia and Iran on the western shore of the Caspian Sea. Then the corridor enters Iran, crossing the country from the Azerbaijani border in the northwest, through the cities of Rasht and Kazvin and Tehran, and south all the way to the port of Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf. The entire length of that corridor is 7,200 kilometers. It costs 30% less to move cargo through it than through the alternative route via the Suez Canal. It is 40% shorter in terms of total distance. And from Bandar Abbas, ships reach Mumbai in 4 days, Colombo in 5 days, and the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, in less than 2 days. The Indian Ocean is right there. The entire Indo-Pacific world is right there. and none of the journey passes through a single Western-aligned choke point. Not one. At the moment, this corridor is approximately 75% complete in its physical infrastructure. The railways exist across most of its length, the ports are operational, the road connections are in place. But there is one critical gap that prevents the whole system from functioning seamlessly as a single continuous route. That gap is in northern Iran, in the province of Gilan, where the city of Rasht sits in a green valley between the Alborz Mountains and the Caspian Sea. The Rasht to Astar railway line would close the gap between the Iranian rail network and the Azerbaijani rail network, allowing a cargo train to roll from St. Petersburg all the way to Bandar Abbas without a single break in the rail connection. Without this line, cargo has to be transferred from rail to road vehicles in northern Iran, driven over mountain roads to the Azerbaijani border, and then loaded back onto trains. That transfer adds cost, adds time, adds handling complexity, and reduces the reliability of the whole corridor. It is the one missing link. And as of 2025, over 106 kilometers of that line are already built and operational. Construction on the remaining sections is underway. When the full line is done, the corridor becomes capable of moving 15 million tons of cargo every single year through its integrated rail-sea road system. That is 15 million tons of goods flowing north to south and south to north, connecting Russia, the Caucasus, Iran, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean world without touching Western infrastructure at any point in the journey. Saudi Arabia's interest in this corridor goes far beyond that of a potential customer. Investors from Saudi Arabia, along with counterparts from Qatar, the UAE, and Oman, have been in substantive discussions about directly financing the broad-gauge rail sections that run from Russia's Dagestan region south through Azerbaijan and Iran to Bandar Abbas. Gulf states investing in the INSTC would not just be buying access to a trade route. They would be buying ownership stakes in the infrastructure of a parallel global trading system. And for Saudi Arabia, that ownership transforms its geographic position fundamentally. Saudi Arabia already controls two of the world's most important maritime choke points. Adding investment control over the north-south land corridor that bypasses those same choke points from the other direction would make Saudi Arabia not just an energy supplier and a geographic pivot, but a logistics empire. A country that shapes how the world moves things, not just what those things are made of. There's another country in this story that does not get nearly enough attention. India. India is the third pillar of what the INSTC was designed to serve. India is the world's most populous country, the fastest growing major economy on Earth, and a massive importer of oil, coal, fertilizers, and industrial goods from Russia. Before the INSTC, Indian traders moving goods to and from Russia had no good option. They either shipped through the Suez Canal, a route that takes between 25 and 40 days depending on the origin port, or they used air freight at extraordinary cost, or they trucked goods through multiple countries with multiple border crossings and multiple customs regimes. The NSTC cuts that journey from Russia to India to approximately 12 to 15 days. For a country that is purchasing tens of billions of dollars of Russian oil and selling back manufactured goods and pharmaceuticals, that is a difference that changes the economics of the entire relationship. India is investing directly in the INSTC, including in the Iranian port of Chabahar on the Gulf of Oman, which serves as the Indian Ocean anchor of the corridor. India is not a passive beneficiary of what Russia and Saudi Arabia are building. India is an active participant, and its participation adds the weight of 4 billion people in the world's fifth largest economy to the logic of the alternative system being assembled. And India's involvement brings in another dimension that is easy to miss. India purchases Russian oil. It has been doing so in enormous quantities since 2022, when Russian oil became deeply discounted because Western companies refused to buy it. India has been paying for some of that oil in rupees. China has been paying for Russian energy in yuan. When the world's two most populous countries are buying oil in non-dollar currencies from the world's third largest oil producer, the petrodollar system is not collapsing. But it is bending. And the corridor being built between Russia and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states is the physical infrastructure that will eventually support the financial architecture that makes non-dollar energy trade not just possible, but routine. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 strategy connects directly to this ambition. Mohammed bin Salman's plan to transform the Saudi economy away from oil dependence rests heavily on making Saudi Arabia a global hub for logistics, tourism, technology, and advanced manufacturing. Saudi Arabia is building NEOM, a $500 billion futuristic development in the northwest of the country. It is expanding its ports on both the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf simultaneously. It is building new free economic zones and industrial corridors. All of this requires connectivity, and the INSTC provides a northern connectivity that links Saudi Arabia to the vast Eurasian market in a way that the current Suez-dependent system never fully does. The two projects, Saudi Vision 2030 and the International North-South Transport Corridor, fit together like pieces of a single larger design. The bilateral trade numbers between Russia and Saudi Arabia have moved in a direction that most analysts did not see coming just 5 years ago. In 2024, total trade between the two countries exceeded $3.8 billion, representing a 62% increase in a single year. Then, in just the first quarter of 2025, trade volume quadrupled compared to the same period a year earlier. To put that in context, normal trade growth between established partners in good years might be 5 to 10% annually. A 62% jump followed immediately by a quadrupling of volume in a quarter is not organic commercial growth. That is the result of a decision made at the highest levels of two governments to build supply chains, to create mutual dependencies, to move as fast as possible toward an economic integration that neither side intends to reverse. Russian Railways is now building rail connections for NEOM. Russian IT companies have established operations in the Saudi market. Russian drone and logistics technology companies like UVL Robotics are operating inside the kingdom. Russian and Saudi engineers are working on the same projects in the same desert. In December 2025, on the sidelines of the 9th Russian-Saudi Intergovernmental Commission meeting in Riyadh, the two countries signed a mutual visa exemption agreement. Russians became the first non-Gulf Cooperation Council nationals in history to be granted visa-free access to Saudi Arabia. Saudi citizens received the same access to Russia. Visa-free travel is not a small diplomatic gesture. It is the enabling condition for all the commercial and technical and human integration that needs to happen for a big bilateral relationship to become a real and durable one. And then there's the defense deal, confirmed by leaked documents in 2025. Saudi Arabia paid Russian state-owned defense companies more than 2 billion euros for an air defense system. 2 billion euros, at the peak of Western sanctions against Russia, while American officials were calling on Gulf states to help isolate the Kremlin, while European capitals were cutting every possible tie to Moscow. Riyadh quietly wrote that check. You do not make a 2 billion euro defense purchase from a country you regard as a temporary commercial partner. You make that purchase from a country you have decided to trust with the protection of your airspace. That transaction tells you more about where this relationship really stands than any diplomatic communique ever written. The energy layer of this partnership is where it first showed its true strength to the world. But there is a dimension to Russia's Middle East strategy that adds another layer of meaning to everything happening with Saudi Arabia. Russia has been a major player in the Middle East for years. It intervened militarily in Syria in 2015 and saved the Assad government from collapse. It has deep relationships with Iran, which is not only a founding member of the INSTC, but also a country that shares Russia's interest in building systems that bypass Western financial infrastructure. Russia has influence in Libya. It has relationships with actors across Iraq. It maintains arms sales relationships across the region. And in 2024, the Assad government fell in Syria, removing one of Russia's most important military footholds in the Arab world. That development made Russia's relationship with Saudi Arabia more important, not less, because Russia's influence in the Middle East is now more dependent on economic and diplomatic relationships than on military bases. Saudi Arabia, as the leading Sunni Arab power, the host of Islam's 2 holiest cities, and the wealthiest government in the Gulf, is a partner that can provide Russia with a kind of regional legitimacy and a set of diplomatic connections that military power alone cannot buy. At the same time, the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran that China brokered in March 2023 opened a door that would not have been possible 5 years earlier. Saudi Arabia and Iran, longtime adversaries who had severed diplomatic relations in 2016, are now talking again. They have reopened embassies. And because Iran is the geographic center of the INSTC corridor, Saudi Arabia investing in that corridor is only possible if the Saudi-Iran relationship is functioning at a basic diplomatic level. The China-brokered normalization was therefore not just a bilateral diplomatic development. It was a prerequisite for the broader Eurasian infrastructure project to include Saudi Arabia as a meaningful partner. Everything connects to everything else in this story. That is what makes it so important to understand all of it together rather than any single piece in isolation. The energy layer of this partnership is where it first showed its true strength to the world. In October 2022, with Western officials urgently appealing to Saudi Arabia to pump more oil and starve Russia of energy revenue, OPEC Plus announced a 2 million barrel per day production cut, the largest coordinated cut in years. Oil prices stayed elevated. Russia kept earning. And Saudi Arabia delivered a message without ever saying it out loud. The message was, we will not be a tool of someone else's foreign policy. American officials were furious. They accused Saudi Arabia publicly and privately of actively helping Russia survive sanctions. Saudi Arabia did not apologize. It did not explain. It continued. And every time that partnership was tested by Western pressure and held together anyway, both sides drew the same lesson. A partner that stays when staying is costly is a partner you can count on. Beneath the energy coordination and the trade growth and the defense deals, the financial layer of this parallel world is being quietly assembled. Saudi Arabia joined Project M-Bridge in 2024. M-Bridge is a multi-central bank digital currency system that allows participating governments to settle international payments using blockchain-based digital currencies, without routing the transaction through SWIFT, without denominating it in dollars, and without any Western financial institution involved in clearing or settlement. The participants include China, the UAE, Hong Kong, Thailand, and now Saudi Arabia. The platform has completed real transactions between real central banks. It is not a concept. It is operational. And Saudi Arabia's participation is the detail that matters most, because Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. If the world's largest oil exporter begins settling even a fraction of its energy exports through a non-dollar, non-SWIFT system, the foundational logic of the petrodollar begins to shift in ways that cannot be quietly reversed. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has already fallen from 71% in 2008 to 56.3% today. Central banks worldwide have been buying physical gold at over 1,000 metric tons per year for 3 consecutive years in a row. They are accumulating an asset that no government can freeze, that no sanctions order can touch, and that no financial network can exclude them from using. Russia holds a substantial portion of its national wealth in gold and yuan. China and Russia transact most of their bilateral trade in currencies that bypass the dollar entirely. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. The infrastructure of a world where the dollar is one currency among several, rather than the universal default, is being built piece by piece, settlement by settlement, agreement by agreement. Saudi Arabia's approach to all of this is the most strategically sophisticated of all the major players involved. Saudi Arabia is not choosing Russia over America. It is doing something far more difficult and far more valuable than a simple choice between blocs. It is maintaining genuine relationships with both sides simultaneously, using the existence of each relationship to strengthen its bargaining position with the other. When Trump returned to the presidency in 2025 and chose Saudi Arabia for his first foreign trip, the American relationship warmed. In November 2025, Trump and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met in Washington and announced agreements on artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and defense cooperation. F-35 fighter jets, previously withheld from Saudi Arabia by prior administrations, were put on the table. Saudi Arabia accepted, and simultaneously maintained its €2 billion defense contract with Russian state firms. Both things true at once. That is not inconsistency. That is the mastery of a country that has decided it will never again be fully beholden to a single patron. The institutional architecture wrapping all of this gives the story its largest frame. Saudi Arabia is now a dialogue partner of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is an invited partner of BRICS. Both institutions are centered on China and Russia. Both are explicitly built to create frameworks for economic and diplomatic cooperation that operate outside Western rules and do not require Western approval. Saudi Arabia's presence in those bodies signals to every country watching, every country thinking about its own options and its own exits, that an alternative table exists, and that table is not empty. It has dozens of members, growing every year. It has financial mechanisms and trade agreements and security dialogues and technical working groups. It has the weight and the momentum of more than half the world's population sitting around it. And Saudi Arabia, by having a seat there, is not defecting from the West. It is expanding its own freedom. The full picture, when you look at all of it together, is of a world quietly reorganizing itself around a new axis. An axis that runs geographically from the Baltic Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the frozen north of Russia to the Indian Ocean, through the mountains of the Caucasus and the plateau of Iran, through digital ledgers clearing transactions in yuan and rials and rupees without a dollar in the chain, through gold vaults filling up in Moscow and Riyadh and Beijing, through rail lines being laid kilometer by kilometer, through terrain that used to be irrelevant to global commerce and is becoming its alternative spine. This new axis is not finished. It is under construction. But construction sites, given enough time and enough investment and enough political will, eventually become cities, eventually become corridors, eventually become the new normal that nobody questions anymore because it has always been there. The West built the current global system after the most destructive war in human history. It built it because it had the power and the resources and the urgency to build something new in the ruins. And for 80 years, that system produced enormous prosperity for much of the world and genuine stability in many regions. But that same system has also been used, with increasing frequency and increasing force, as a geopolitical weapon. Every time the West freezes reserves, every time it cuts a country off from SWIFT, every time it weaponizes the dollar or the payment system or the shipping infrastructure, it sends an identical signal to every country watching from outside the fight. The signal is, your place in our system is conditional. It depends on our approval of your behavior. And if we ever decide you have crossed a line, we will use the infrastructure you depend on against you. That signal, delivered often enough and forcefully enough, does not produce compliance forever. Eventually, it produces engineers laying a railway track through the mountains of northern Iran. Russia and Saudi Arabia are building exits, not because they have declared war on the West or want the world to be less stable or more chaotic, but because the most basic instinct of any rational government is to preserve its freedom of action. To never be so dependent on any single system that the people running that system can simply decide to turn off your economy on a Tuesday afternoon in Brussels. To always have another road. And the road they are building together, from the frozen Baltic South to the burning Gulf, from rubles and reals to digital currencies and gold, from bilateral trade to multilateral institutions to shared defense contracts to interlocked rail systems, is going to be one of the defining roads of the 21st century. The geography was always the foundation. The mountains and deserts and inland seas were always there, waiting. The Caspian sat quiet for centuries while the world's great trade routes flowed elsewhere. The valley at Rasht waited for its railway. The port of Bandar Abbas waited for a northern corridor that would make it something larger than an oil loading terminal. The map was always pointing toward this, always pointing toward the moment when someone would finally decide to connect what geography had always made connectable, but politics and dependency had always kept apart. That moment has arrived. The foundations are being poured, the rails are being laid, the agreements are being signed, the money is moving. And when what is being built is finally finished, the world that exists on the other side of its completion will be different from the one we live in today. Not because of a war that everybody watched, but because of a road that almost nobody did. That is how power actually shifts, not in the moments that everyone sees coming. In the moments that were being built while everyone was looking away,